welcome to this special show on ET Now, Managing Responsible Business, the Role of Reputation and Ethics. Now, this discussion is brought to you in the backdrop of a report which has been released by CIMA. It's fourth in the last 4 years. That is the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, which has really been tabling and following how companies are setting up processes in order to conduct business in a more ethical manner. Are they really walking the talk? Those are some of the aspects that we are going to focus on. And indeed, in the current context of nearly a scam every day, whether it is here in India or overseas, these are critical issues that companies need to look at. They appear to be focusing on them, but are they really bringing about that much-needed behavioral change as far as the internal DNA is concerned? Let me pose that question to my panelists who join me on the show. Let me start off with Keshav Murugesh, who is the CEO of WNS. Andrew Harding, the Managing Director at CIMA. Girish Bhatt, the CFO of Gammon India. And finally, we have Neville Dumasia, Partner Risk Advisory, ENY. Gentlemen, many thanks for joining us on the show. So let me start with you, Andrew, because CIMA has been conducting these studies. Take us through really the key findings this time around as far as business ethics is concerned. One would be tempted to ask the question, how bad is it really right now in the current environment?
There are really two things that we're finding. The first thing is that companies are actually doing more reporting. There are more codes around this area. But I think the second and perhaps the concerning factor around it is accountants working in business are feeling under pressure like they never have done before to behave unethically. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, that's the cause for concern. That's the reason why we're worried. We are tracking stories and scams and scandals almost on a daily basis. I mean, post-Satyam, of course, the spotlight has been even brighter as far as, or stronger as far as India Inc. is concerned. But in this current environment, would you say things are taking a turn for the worse in terms of pressure on companies to meet those bottom line targets and forget, you know, good CSR and ethics, so to speak?
My view is as follows. I think the pressure on an organization to perform in terms of having sustainable growth will always exist. Whether it's a transactional period of a quarter or a year or a couple of years, that to my mind is lesser of a challenge because it's really an accounting framework. But a corporate is actually required to have sustainable, profitable growth. And to my mind, therefore, I don't really think the situation is actually worsening. I think the situation is just unearthing some of the issues, some of the scandals that have come to fore today. And I think we are seeing that not only in India, but we are seeing it across the world as well.
Keshav, how would you like to join in terms of this conversation? Because trust deficit, it exists perhaps to many of us who are observing what's happening, but also to those within the organization. How do you build that trust to really believe, especially in this current environment?
That's a great question. I think from my perspective, what I'm going to do is to keep building this environment of trust in you in terms of what corporates are doing, corporates like WNS are doing, and what corporates can do actually in this space. And if you actually look at, Peter Drucker's definition of ethics, he actually says ethical behavior is, what you use, as a personal standard in a business situation. It's as simple as that, right? What you would do for yourself and how are you now conducting yourself, while running a company. So I think from a company's point of view, as Neville said, the need, to continuously grow and to be profitable is something that is dictated. You need to keep doing that. But at the same time, if you don't create a set of rules to govern that growth, then you could be, setting yourself up for anarchy, right? And I think that is where, most corporates focus on really creating a very clear mission statement across the company, a very clear set of values at the company, and then driving that by constant fostering and communication of these values across the globe, in every, internal citizens' minds, and also delivering that message to the external forces, your
right.
suppliers, the people you do business with, because we all understand that end of the day, it is not just your employees that want to feel safe and feel, good about working in an organization. It's also your suppliers, who want to feel empowered and feel, good working with you.
Absolutely. In fact, let me take that forward with you, Girish, because in a sense, you left a multinational corporation and you have tried to set up those systems and processes in a promoter-led company here in India. What were the challenges that you faced?
I think the most important thing is, as Keshav was saying, is the tone at the top. And clearly I think you can set up your policies, processes, and what I call it the code of ethics and conduct, you can set it up. But what is more important is that how you communicate to your employees. And for that, what is more important is that the tone at the top. And in my business especially, it is coming from the owners makes a big difference. And that what I think drives the organization in terms of if to drive the organization in a really ethical fashion, because clearly what we are trying to do in the business is that we have got an independent internal audit system, and therefore if any NCRs comes into the business, I think it has been clear guidelines and communication happens from the chairman saying that all these NCRs must be closed in time. And also, if anything which is not been closed, I think he must be communicated.
So clearly we've established one aspect, and this is what your study also talks a lot about, Andrew, in terms of the tone from the top. But, your study also mentions one thing, and that is there is a gap between rhetoric and reality over ethical performance. Does that start all the way from the top? Is that what your study seems to suggest in terms of its findings this time?
I mean, it's around, we talk about tone from the top, and that is senior managers, leaders, being seen to walk the walk. But that's leaders throughout the business. It's not just the board directors who are the leaders. There are leaders at every level, and it has to be completely embedded. And that involves, more than just the rhetoric. That involves training. It involves understanding. It involves deep commitment within the organisation. And I think that's the next step that businesses need to make if they're going to genuinely address this issue.
When companies go multinational, when they go into the national arena, they have to imbibe and follow some of those processes and that code of conduct.
Of course.
It has to come naturally almost.
Of course.
Right.
But that's not to say that the mass majority don't follow those. It may not just be as well articulated and followed as some of the larger organizations do.
Right, because that's a scale, or rather that's the aspect, that the multinational aspect that one takes on board. But Keshav, when you actually come to doing business in India, many people would say, listen, just look the other way, because it's a small price to pay, so to speak, in actual terms, for the business gains that you'll make for perhaps not following some of those codes.
I'm going to continue to be the dissenter. And again, if you look at the history, you look at what Chanakya says in the Arthashastra, you look at what so many of these old people have said, historians, Socrates,
Right.
Look at what Plato has said, you will see that all of them have said, Adam Smith, for example, in The Wealth of Nations, they all say that business and ethical behavior cannot be divorced from each other. So it's been there, it's available, and people have been propagating it for centuries. And from an India point of view, my experience has been that if you are tough and if you send out a clear signal that you are not going to compromise in terms of your values and your ethics, nobody can come in your way.
Okay, let's take a break on that note, because when we come back, we'll discuss in terms of some of those practices that have been followed, some of those which have worked, some which haven't, both within India as well as internationally. You're watching our special show which focuses on business ethics, brought to you in association with SEMA. Stay with us on ET Now. Welcome back. Let's take that point forward that Keshav just mentioned, and I'd like to turn to Andrew on this, because Andrew, today in the world, if you take a look at the banking industry, clearly it's under a huge cloud. In India, of course, we've had our share of many scams and scandals, and the point of the matter is there seems to be an increasing cry for better regulation, because the conclusion seems to be that companies simply cannot be trusted to do the right thing. Do you think is that where the answer lies?
I think every time we see a scandal, there's always a cry for more regulation, and each time we see that regulation coming in, we have another scandal. It's not about regulation. It's about a mindset. It's about how people believe they should behave. It's about business managers doing the right thing, even when they're not even when they're not being watched. Regulation's about doing the right thing when you are being watched. So there's much more to it than just regulation. Regulation isn't the solution. It's a quick thing for governments to say, okay, we will regulate, we will solve it with that. But that doesn't touch the surface of it.
Because your report mentions in the last 4 years, as you've been tracking sort of the development or the progress on this front made by companies, it clearly seems to point to the fact that companies are putting those structures in place. But yet, in terms of behavior, as you mentioned in your report, the behavioral intent, that is taking a long time to change.
I think that's the case in any business. If you try to change a culture, that takes much, much longer than changing a process.
Neville, let me come to you here, because when it comes to our, for instance, we are in the midst of a government which is talking about increasing regulation, making it mandatory for companies to invest, for instance, 2% of their profits in CSR. It's invited a whole lot of angst-ridden statements from India Inc. But, the government believes that this is the right way to do it. How would you
So I quite agree with Andrew. I think the answer is not more regulation, because if you compare several of our regulations across most of the Asian countries, you'll find that India is one of the most regulated countries in the Asian economy. The answer really lies in how do you monitor and how do you regulate. So how do you actually monitor and then penalize a company or a corporate which is found of wrongdoing? Just don't try and penalize everybody by putting in an additional regulation, because that's not really the answer.
Right, because, for instance, and Girish, I'd like to bring you in here. What's been happening, for instance, here in India is the tide has turned for worse. A lot of Indian companies and their managements have actually come under the cloud, wherein previously they were seen as star performers. Suddenly, many of those practices are now being questioned. So hence you say, listen, this is like, standing in quicksand, because you really don't know, what's the right spot to stand in, wherein I can actually build a foundation from here.
I think when you talk of reputation and ethics, there is always a pressure within the organization and outside. It happens. But critically, what is more important in any organization is, do you look at short term or do you look at the long term? And I believe an organization must look at the long term, because the price you pay for all such wrongdoings is quite heavy. It can drop your share price, and the market capitalization of a company can drop to peanuts, Secondly, I think you lose customers, you lose the bottom line. And today's in the world of internet and the social media, I think the wrong words passed on worldwide very easily in seconds.
Right.
And therefore, I think people are aware of these situations, and therefore, I don't think, what is more important, as I've been repeatedly saying, is the tone at the top. Right. You must set up clear processes within the organization, and the top management must drive to strengthen those processes.
Right. In fact, Keshav, let me bring you in here, because would you say it's sort of different for customer-focused companies, wherein you get the response and hence the whole social networking sort of impact comes in, and there's the impact on the brand when you do something wrong, as opposed to where there is a distance, wherein you are not interacting directly with the end consumer, so to speak, and hence perhaps the pressures are different?
I don't think so. I think the pressures are the same everywhere. And my advice to any professional manager is, you'd rather be called ineffective than a crook, right? So as long as you're focused on living those values and driving some of those programs across the company, very difficult for you to be unsuccessful in terms of at least being seen as a high ethics kind of a company. And all of them have just said, every company has its own processes and mechanisms to announce, what the values are, how they want to reward a certain kind of performance, how they drive, that kind of behavior and things like that. And it's the same, for us as well.
That brings perhaps us back to a question we should have started with. How do you actually define business ethics? Andrew, after 4 years of doing the survey, we heard Peter Drucker's definition, there are various definitions. From a management accountant's point of view, where would it be?
I'll give you two things, and I think these are maxims you can work with. The first thing is, always do the right thing, even when you're not being watched. Second thing is, if you'd be embarrassed by your behaviour being reported in the newspaper the following day, don't do it.
Okay, let me just take that definition of business ethics and apply it, and bring in Neville at this point, and apply it to really auditors and accountants who've been a much maligned lot.
I agree. I completely agree with that. And I think the issue really is also about us as the accounting profession or the auditing profession actually articulating what we do at corporates a lot better to the larger public, because I think there is a sense that as soon as a fraud breaks out, what were the auditors doing? And clearly the answer is not about us having the ability or the ability to actually carry out a review of every single fraud that would occur within an organization. The job is really to provide an assurance over financial statements so that the stakeholders at large have an understanding that yes, the systems, processes laid down are operating effectively, and there's a reasonable assurance that your accounts are free of misstatements or material misstatements.
So there you heard it. That's the framework within which auditors and accountants are really functioning in. But we still have more questions for them and, of course, for industry at whole. Let's continue with this discussion after this quick break, where we'll focus on the external environment and really how much of an impact that has as far as companies are concerned and how ethically they run their business. Stay with us. Welcome back. So we're focusing on managing responsible businesses and the role of ethics therein. Andrew, let me turn to you, because let's now turn to another aspect. We focused on employees, their behavior, and of course, really how we define business ethics. Now we come to the external environment, and by this I just don't mean the economic environment, but also the governments and the regulations within which, and really the environment within which a company operates. How important is it in terms of really having that push-pull pressure in terms of ensuring that companies ethically run their business?
I think you have to get the balances absolutely right, and at the moment it appears we don't have those balances right. One of the things that started to come out from work we did with the London School of Economics at the beginning of the global downturn in 2009 was a lot of thought around, we do an awful lot of questioning around bad news, around corporate failures, but so many of the problems in 2008, 2009 came in companies who'd been celebrating supernormal profits for the previous decade, and we'd never questioned them. And they've been allowed to go on, go on, go on. And then the downturn comes and everyone goes, those supernormal profits weren't real.
Right, absolutely.
So we need to get to question really good news as hard as we question bad news.
Indeed, that's a very important point. When those supernormal profits come, we really forget to look deeper into them, and it's only during the bad times that we start focusing on that. Girish, you would agree with that, but in terms of the external environment, of course, the economic climate is an important one. Also in terms of, for instance, doing business here in India as opposed to doing business anywhere else. Most companies would say it's a whole different ball game, and you have to forget all the rules that you set for yourself in many other markets, especially developed markets. What are some of those rules that one has to forget or one has to live with here?
I think clearly when you talk of ethics and reputation, the rules are really, you laid down the code of conduct and the ethics into an organization. Now, let us say when you are going into buying, awarding contract to the suppliers, clearly one has to take into account those aspects, and you can't compromise on that, because then you are sending a wrong signal in the organization. Similarly, I think clearly when you come across any wrongdoing within the business, how you act on it, whether you put it under the carpet or you just make it happen and disclose it to the employee despite it creating bad impact on the employees and the reputations of few people. But we have to do that to ensure that in the long-term interest of an organization is protected and you embed those values in the organization.
But is that really realistic, Neville? I'd like to bring you in here, because recently I was just speaking to somebody, and they said, when you have to operate in this environment, and especially if it's somebody from the government, then you just simply have to sort of look the other way, because these are systems that we've been running with. I mean, we can't really, wish it away. And you've got to operate. It's part of the business reality. So
my honest sense is as follows. I think it's different strokes for different folks. If you wish to be on the straight and narrow path, and you want to make sure that you will do your business in an ethical fashion, I don't think there is any bar or anything that prevents you from doing so. You may wish to take a shorter cut and therefore go and try and reach X person, Y person, Z person and get your task done faster. But I don't think it is necessarily true of all corporates, because there are several who do stick to the straight and narrow and still get their work done.
Andrew, let me bring in summarizing comments. You've been doing the study for 4 years, and clearly we've heard it's very it's wonderful to hear these kind of statements which are being put across. Clearly the intention is there, and there is a real desire to bring about a kind of change in the way systems are functioning. But at the end of the day, Andrew, what is it that you're sensing in terms of really what still needs to be done? Where is the gap the largest still, and where has there been the maximum improvement?
I think we're seeing the maximum improvement is in actually understanding that there is an issue, setting up the codes. We're seeing a big improvement there. Where we're seeing the gap is in the reality of behaviour around that. So the next step, once you've got the code, and we've talked about this, it's about the tone from the top. It's about training and embedding it so that everybody in the organisation is living those values. And then finally, it's about the feedback loop. It's about enforcement and making that sort of thing happen. And as we've just been hearing, nobody's exempt from this. No country is different in a way that exempts them. Every country has its own culture, but ethics are something which has to be constant.
And I think that's a reality, Girish, that's dawning upon all companies. We mentioned large caps, but the small and medium enterprises, companies that you're also heading, that realization is coming across?
Absolutely, it is coming up, because I think as you are globalizing, if you are growing, you can't grow if you don't have proper system, processes and code of conduct within the organization. Because it is easy when you are small, you can get away with it. When you grow, you can't do it. And the next most important thing is, therefore, the top management tone at the top. And if you look at myself, you are the lens through which I think your team sees the whole organization. So really walk the talk is very critical. And it is a process. I'm telling you, it won't change immediately, but when you are building the culture, it takes time. And the stronger foundation you create, I think when the new employees and the organization is created, it becomes easier to build the organization. So that is what I thought I would like to leave with in summarizing, because it's a long process, not easy, but in India, many good organizations have started in that process. They have understood the pitfalls of not doing it, and the price you pay for not doing it, and therefore I think reputation and ethics in the long term creates value for the business.
But we are not short of cynicism, and especially for us here in the media, never, because one would say for one company that does the right thing, there are millions of small and